I always loved being outdoors. There was something about the stillness of the wilderness that made me feel alive. In the fall of 2014, I decided to take a solo camping trip to get away from the noise of everyday life. I wasn't inexperienced. I'd been camping on and off since I was a teenager, so I thought I knew what I was doing. I chose a remote area in central Montana, a stretch of wilderness far enough from any towns or major roads that it promised total solitude. It was about a 6-hour drive from my home in Bozeman, followed by a grueling 2-hour hike to a spot I'd marked on a map months earlier. The area was perfect. Thick trees surrounded a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. There was a stream a short walk away for water, and no sign of anyone else having been there recently. I arrived just after noon, set up my tent, and started a small fire to make some coffee. The first day was uneventful, exactly how I'd hoped. I spent hours exploring the area, taking note of animal tracks and enjoying the quiet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. I huddled by the fire, ate a quick meal, and crawled into my tent for the night. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the tent was dark. I lay there for a moment, listening. It was dead silent. Not even the usual rustling of leaves or chirping of crickets. That alone was strange. Then I heard it. It was a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the woods. It wasn't words, just a low, breathy noise that sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was the wind and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound persisted. The next morning, I dismissed the noise as my imagination playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking further into the forest, taking in the sights and making mental notes of landmarks. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting again. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the ground outside my tent. My heart raced as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the steps were too heavy, too measured. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I reached for the hunting knife I always kept by my sleeping bag. Minutes passed, and there was nothing but silence. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died completely, and the clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing. I stayed awake for hours, gripping the knife and scanning the shadows, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The third day, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things, but I couldn't focus. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. That night, things got worse. I woke up to a loud, guttural sound that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a growl exactly. It was deeper, more primal, like something trying to mimic an animal but not quite getting it right. The sound was close, too close. I sat up, clutching my knife, and listened as the noise moved around the clearing. It didn't sound like footsteps anymore. It was more like a dragging sound, mixed with the occasional crack of branches. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. As much as I loved being outdoors, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. That's when I saw it. About a mile from camp, I came across tracks in the dirt. They looked like human footprints, but they were wrong. The toes were too long, and the stride was uneven, almost limping. I followed them for a few yards before realizing they were leading toward my camp, not away from it. A chill ran down my spine as I turned and headed for my car as quickly as I could without running. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and got in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. It was standing at the edge of the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't make out the details. It was tall, with long, thin limbs and a head that seemed too small for its body. I didn't stick around to get a better look. The drive back to Bozeman was a blur. I couldn't shake the image of that thing from my mind. I still don't know what it was, but I haven't been camping since. Whatever it was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal either. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those tracks leading to my camp and wonder how long it had been watching me before I noticed. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. It was late October, a season when the rain in the United Kingdom seems to never stop. I was camping alone, something I'd done plenty of times before, but this time felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just that faint feeling in your gut, like something's not quite right. I had decided to pitch my tent near Dartmoor, a vast and remote stretch of land with endless moors, ancient stone circles, and twisted old trees. It's a place where silence stretches for miles, broken only by the sound of wind or the occasional sheep. The rain had been relentless all day, soaking me to the bone as I hiked deeper into the wilderness. By the time I found a decent spot to set up camp, the light was fading fast. I chose a small clearing tucked between a few large boulders, hoping they'd shield me from the worst of the wind. The ground was damp, but I managed to pitch the tent without too much trouble. After changing into dry clothes, I crawled into my sleeping bag and listened to the rain hammer against the tent. It was a soothing sound, one I usually enjoyed, but that unease from earlier still lingered. I told myself it was just the weather getting to me. Cold, wet, and tired, I decided to call it a night early. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, unsure of what had pulled me from my sleep. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, and the wind had died down completely. The world outside was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of water from the trees. I lay there for a moment, staring at the tent's ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on wet grass. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the rhythmic movement of an animal. These were deliberate, measured steps. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears to hear more. The steps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy, but they weren't rushing either. My mind raced with possibilities. Another camper? A lost hiker? But why were they walking around my tent in the dead of night without saying anything? The footsteps stopped directly behind me, where the entrance to my tent was. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric, like someone brushing against it. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed. At least it felt like minutes, and then the steps started again, this time moving away from the tent. I stayed frozen in place, waiting until the sound faded completely before daring to move. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. I grabbed the small camping knife I always kept with me and held it tightly. It was a pitiful defense, but it was better than nothing. The idea of going outside to investigate was out of the question. Instead, I sat there, knife in hand, and waited for dawn. The night dragged on. Every creak of the trees, every drip of water, every distant animal call made me jump. I kept imagining the footsteps returning, the tent zipper being undone, someone reaching in. But nothing happened. Eventually, the pale light of morning filtered through the tent fabric, and the world outside seemed a little less threatening. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peeled peeked outside. The clearing was empty, no sign of anyone or anything unusual. But when I stepped out, I saw them, footprints. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the clearing to my tent and then away into the trees. The tracks were too large to belong to a child, but the spacing suggested they didn't belong to someone running. Whoever it was had been walking slowly, purposefully. I followed the trail a short distance, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see if I could figure out who or what had been out there. I hiked in the direction the tracks had gone, keeping my knife in hand and my senses on high alert. About half a mile from my campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked against a tree was a small, makeshift shelter made of tarps and branches. It looked like it had been there for a while, but it wasn't abandoned. Inside, I found a few personal belongings, an old backpack, some food wrappers, a battered notebook. The notebook was what really got to me. Flipping through its damp pages, I saw crude drawings and notes. Most of it didn't make much sense. Random scribbles, strange symbols, but then I found a page with a drawing of a tent. My tent. It was unmistakable, down to the boulders I'd camped near. Below the drawing were the words, "Watching tonight." I dropped the notebook like it had burned me. My mind raced. Whoever had drawn this had been out there last night, watching me. Maybe they were still nearby. I didn't waste any more time. I sprinted back to my campsite, heart hammering in my chest. I tore down my tent as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack without bothering to fold it properly. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. I hiked out of there as fast as my legs would carry me, not stopping until I reached my car hours later. Even then, I didn't feel safe. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the events over and over. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that notebook, the crude drawing of my tent, the words scrawled beneath it. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Whoever that person was, they had been out there in the rain watching me. They didn't try to talk to me or steal from me. They just watched. And that, more than anything, is what haunts me. It was the summer of 2016 when we decided to head out for a weekend camping trip. The idea wasn't mine. My wife, Megan, suggested it. She thought it would be a good way for us to bond with her sister, Lauren, and her husband, Rick, who also happened to be Megan's ex-husband. Strange dynamic, I know, but Megan and Rick had been divorced for years before we got together, and they always claimed they were better as friends. I wasn't thrilled about spending a weekend in the woods with him, but I figured I could tolerate it for Megan's sake. Besides, Lauren insisted Rick had been working on himself and was a changed man. Megan picked out a secluded camping spot in the Ozarks, far from the usual crowded sites. She thought it would give us some privacy to relax. I wasn't a big fan of the isolation, but Megan assured me it was a beautiful spot. An open clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek nearby. She loved nature, and I didn't want to spoil her excitement. We packed up the SUV early Friday morning. Tents, sleeping bags, coolers stuffed with food, and enough supplies to last the weekend. I drove while Megan navigated, and Lauren and Rick followed in their car. The dirt road leading to the campsite was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle at a time. The forest felt endless as we bumped along, the towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were driving into another world. When we finally reached the clearing, I had to admit Megan was right. The place was beautiful. The ground was soft with pine needles, the air smelled fresh, and the gentle sound of the creek added to the serenity. We set up our tents in a semicircle around a fire pit someone had built long ago. Megan and I shared one tent, while Lauren and Rick took the other. The first evening was uneventful. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, shared some laughs, and watched the stars come out. Rick was surprisingly easygoing, even cracking a few jokes that made everyone laugh. I started to let my guard down, thinking maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. The next day, we decided to explore the area. Megan and Lauren wanted to hike along the creek, so Rick and I tagged along. The path was overgrown and we had to push through thick brush at times. The forest felt alive, with birds chirping and squirrels darting through the undergrowth. The creek wound its way through the trees, the water clear and cold. About 2 miles in, we came across an old, rusted pickup truck sitting in a small clearing near the creek. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, with vines creeping over it and the tires long gone. There were bullet holes in the door and shattered glass on the ground. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but Megan shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an old hunting truck. We took a few pictures of the truck and continued on, eventually looping back to camp. That evening, Rick suggested we do some target practice with the rifle he'd brought along. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but Megan and Lauren seemed okay with it. Rick set up some cans on a log and started firing. He was a good shot, hitting almost every can. When it was my turn, I missed more than I hit, which Rick found amusing. I bit my tongue and laughed it off. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I noticed something strange. The forest, usually full of sounds, had gone eerily silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crackling of the fire. It was unsettling, but I didn't mention it. I didn't want to seem paranoid. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay awake, listening to the faint sound of the creek and trying to ignore the occasional snapping twig outside. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. At first, I thought it was Rick or Lauren, but the footsteps were heavy and deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. I nudged Megan awake, and she gave me a groggy look. I whispered for her to stay quiet and listened. The footsteps circled our tent, then stopped. I slowly unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight outside. Nothing. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light across the clearing. I scanned the area but saw no one. Reluctantly, I zipped the tent back up and lay down, my ears straining for any sound. The footsteps didn't return, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told the others about what I'd heard. Rick laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. Megan and Lauren seemed a little more concerned, but agreed it was likely nothing. We spent the day fishing at the creek, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. By the time we returned to camp, the mood had lightened. That night, the silence returned. The forest felt heavy, oppressive, like it was holding its breath. I stayed up late, sitting by the dying fire and staring into the darkness. Around midnight, I heard it again. Those heavy footsteps, this time coming from the direction of the creek. I grabbed the rifle Rick had left by the fire and stood up, my hands shaking. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then they stopped, just beyond the circle of light from the fire. I held my breath, the rifle trembling in my hands. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I didn't wake anyone this time. I didn't want to seem paranoid or weak, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The final day of the trip, we decided to pack up early. The unease had settled over all of us, though no one wanted to admit it. As we loaded up the cars, I noticed something chilling. On the back of Rick's SUV, written in the thick layer of dust, were the words, "Leave now." I showed it to the others and everyone went pale. Rick tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably some prank, but his voice lacked conviction. We didn't waste any more time. We got in our cars and started down the dirt road, leaving the campsite behind. As we drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following us. When we finally hit the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We never talked about that trip again. Something or someone had been out there with us, watching. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to the Ozarks. I was 34 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the wilderness of Montana. It was late summer of 2017, and I wanted to disconnect for a while. Work had been wearing me down, and the constant buzz of city life made me crave the quiet isolation of the woods. I had been camping plenty of times before, always in areas where other campers weren't too far away. But this time, I wanted something different. I wanted real solitude. I spent weeks researching the area, picking a spot that seemed remote yet manageable. I settled on an area about 20 miles into the Lewis and Clark National Forest. It was remote but accessible by foot if you had the stamina for the hike. My plan was simple. Hike in for about 8 hours, set up camp near a creek I'd spotted on the map, and spend a few days living off the grid. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 4 days, and a reliable hunting knife. I also carried a small pistol. I didn't like bringing a firearm with me, but it felt like a necessary precaution in bear country. The hike in was uneventful, but the solitude hit me hard once I was deep into the woods. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of birds. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd chosen, a flat clearing about 50 feet from the creek. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the evening enjoying the quiet. As the sun set, the forest around me darkened quickly. The stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them in the city. It was beautiful, and I felt like I'd made the right choice coming out here. The first night was uneventful, but something felt off the next morning. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I woke up around 6 a.m., the sunlight filtering through the thin fabric of my tent. As I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, I noticed something strange. Some of my gear had been moved. My pack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now lying flat on the ground a few feet away. The food container I'd secured was slightly ajar, though nothing seemed to be missing. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, a raccoon maybe, but there were no bite marks or scratches on anything, and the way the pack had been moved felt deliberate. I brushed it off and went about my day. I spent the morning exploring the area, following the creek upstream and enjoying the quiet, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every now and then, I felt like I was being watched. I'd stop and scan the trees, but nothing ever seemed out of place. By the time I returned to camp in the afternoon, the feeling had grown stronger. I decided to check the perimeter of my campsite, looking for signs of animals or anything unusual. That's when I found it. A single boot print in the dirt about 20 yards from my tent. It was large, clearly from a man's boot, and fresh. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen another person since I started the hike, and this area was far from any established trails. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. I told myself it could have been an old print, maybe from a hunter who had passed through weeks ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The edges of the print were sharp, not weathered or worn. Someone had been here. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept the fire going longer than usual and stayed close to it, my pistol within arm's reach. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep much, and when I did, it was restless. The next morning, I found more signs. Another boot print, closer to my tent this time, and a broken branch that hadn't been there the day before. Whoever it was, they were getting bolder. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, almost suffocating. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the trees, watching me. As I started the hike back, I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. I moved quickly, almost jogging at times, wanting to put as much distance between myself and the campsite as possible. About 2 hours into the hike, I saw him. He was standing about 50 feet off the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then he moved. He stepped out from behind the tree, and I got a clear look at him. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a scruffy beard and dirty clothes. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He wasn't carrying any gear, just a long hunting knife in his right hand. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He didn't say anything, didn't make any noise at all. He just stood there, staring at me. Then he started walking toward me. I backed away, my hand instinctively going to the pistol on my hip. I didn't want to use it, but the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey, made it clear I didn't have a choice. When he was about 20 feet away, I shouted for him to stop. He didn't. He kept coming, his grip on the knife tightening. I drew the pistol and fired a warning shot into the ground in front of him. He stopped, but only for a moment. Then he lunged at me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I fired again, this time aiming for his chest. The shot echoed through the trees, and he collapsed to the ground. I stood there, shaking, the gun still in my hand. He wasn't moving. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. He was dead. I didn't feel relief. I felt sick. I had just killed a man. But as I looked at him, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His knife wasn't just any hunting knife, it was mine. The one I'd left in my tent the night before. He had been in my camp. I stumbled back, my mind racing. He must have been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment. If I hadn't left when I did, I didn't wait around to think about it. I grabbed his knife, wiped my fingerprints from it, and left him there. I hiked back to my car as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief, but that relief was short-lived. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being his victim. I didn't report what happened. I told myself it was because I didn't want to deal with the authorities. But the truth was, I didn't want to relive it. To this day, I can't go into the woods without thinking about him, about how easily he could have killed me, and about the fact that I'll never know if he was alone out there, or if someone else was watching. I never planned to end up deep in the Amazon rainforest. It wasn't on my bucket list, and I didn't grow up dreaming of adventure. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, and somehow, I found myself there in the fall of 2016. I was 28 at the time, fresh out of a job I hated, looking for a change, something to shake up my life. A friend of mine, Adam, had been planning this trip for years, and when he offered me a spot, I thought, why not? We flew into Manaus, a bustling city surrounded by dense jungle. From there, we joined a small group heading into the rainforest for a week-long guided tour. The guide, a wiry man in his 40s named Luis, assured us that we'd experience the real Amazon. I had no idea what that meant, but I nodded along, excited and nervous at the same time. The first few days were everything I'd expected. Oppressive heat, swarms of insects, and an overwhelming sense of being somewhere truly wild. The forest seemed alive, every tree and shadow hiding something. Monkeys swung through the branches, birds called out in strange, alien sounds, and the underbrush seemed to move on its own. It was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. The novelty had worn off, and the weight of the jungle was starting to press down on me. That's when Luis announced we'd be camping that night near an abandoned research station. He said it casually, like it was no big deal, but something about the way he avoided eye contact made me uneasy. The station, as it turned out, was little more than a few weathered wooden structures, half hidden by vines and moss. Luis explained that scientists had used the site decades ago to study the rainforest, but they'd abandoned it in the late 80s. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask. It didn't matter, I was too tired to care. I just wanted to set up my tent and sleep. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The jungle, usually so loud and vibrant, seemed unnaturally quiet. The occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal call only made the silence more pronounced. I told myself it was nothing. The jungle had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay there, listening, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. That's when I noticed it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from one of the old buildings, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I froze. It wasn't an animal sound. It was deliberate, like someone was knocking on wood. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze, but deep down, I knew better. I stayed in my tent, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, praying the sound would stop. Eventually, it did, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I wasn't even sure what I'd heard. We packed up and continued our trek, leaving the station behind. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, we set up camp again, this time in a clearing near a small river. The day had been uneventful, and I was starting to feel more at ease. The jungle, while still intimidating, was beginning to feel almost familiar. That night, after dinner, I decided to wash up in the river. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the water's edge. As I knelt by the river, I heard it again, the same rhythmic tapping. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the forest. My stomach dropped. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight, but the beam only seemed to make the shadows deeper. I told myself it was nothing, just the jungle messing with me again. But as I turned to head back to camp, I caught a glimpse of something, a figure, just on the edge of the light. It was gone before I could focus on it, but I was sure I'd seen it. Someone or something was out there. I ran back to camp, heart racing, and didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told Luis what I'd seen. He nodded, his face grim, and told me to stay close to the group from now on. That was all he said.
No explanation, no reassurance.
Just a warning. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, convinced we were being followed. I started to notice things, broken branches, faint footprints, the feeling of being watched. I wasn't the only one. The others in the group seemed uneasy too, though no one said anything outright. By the time we made it back to Manaus, I was a wreck. I'd lost weight, my clothes were torn, and my nerves were shot. I couldn't wait to get on the plane and leave the jungle behind. But even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same rhythmic tapping, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls or the floorboards. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down I know better. Whatever was out there in the Amazon, it hasn't forgotten me, and I don't think it ever will. It was late October when I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. I'd been dealing with a lot: work stress, family arguments, and just the general feeling of being stuck. Nature had always been my escape, and there was something about the quiet of the woods that helped me feel grounded. I picked a spot deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I wanted to be away from everyone, somewhere remote where I could breathe without distractions. I arrived in the late afternoon. The trees were a mix of orange, red, and brown, their leaves crunching under my boots as I walked. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of damp earth and pine. I parked my car at a small dirt lot at the edge of the trail and packed up my gear. I had my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food and water to last me a couple of days. The trail I chose wasn't marked on most maps. It was one I'd found years ago during a different trip, a narrow path that led to a small clearing by a creek. Hardly anyone knew about it, and that's exactly why I loved it. The hike to the clearing took about 2 hours, and as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest seemed quieter than usual. There were no birds chirping, no rustle of animals in the underbrush, just the sound of my boots on the trail and the occasional gust of wind shaking the branches above. I told myself it was just the season. By late October, most of the animals were either migrating or getting ready for winter. When I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. The light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent a few feet from the creek, careful to avoid any low spots that might collect water if it rained. I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area and built a small fire. As the night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I bundled up in my jacket and sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned chili and bread. The forest was pitch black beyond the circle of light cast by the flames. I could hear the creek bubbling nearby, but other than that, everything was silent. I'd always found the silence comforting, but that night, it felt different. It was too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, my eyes trying to pierce the darkness. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. To calm my nerves, I reminded myself that I was alone out here. The nearest road was miles away, and the chances of anyone stumbling upon my campsite were slim to none. Besides, I had a knife and a hatchet with me just in case. I wasn't completely defenseless. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold was seeping into my bones. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and turned off my headlamp. The darkness was absolute. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my dreams. I lay there in the dark, listening. The creek was still flowing, and the wind had picked up slightly, causing the trees to creak and groan. But there was something else, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I reached for my knife, my hands shaking. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife in my hand, my eyes fixed on the thin fabric of the tent. If there was someone out there, they'd see the glow from my fire. They'd know I was here. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence returned. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever or whatever it was had moved on. I lay back down, though I kept the knife close. Sleep was out of the question, but I tried to rest. Just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. This time, it was right outside my tent. The footsteps were slow, circling around me. I could hear the leaves crunching, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. My blood turned to ice. Whoever it was, they were deliberately walking around my campsite, almost like they were trying to mess with me. I wanted to call out, to yell and scare them off, but fear kept me silent. Instead, I gripped the knife tighter and waited. The footsteps stopped again, and for a moment, I thought they might be gone. Then, without warning, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was a light touch, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The touch moved from one side of the tent to the other, slow and deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were toying with me. I knew I couldn't stay in the tent. I had to get out to face whatever was out there. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, the sound deafening in the stillness. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. The fire had gone out completely, leaving the clearing in darkness. I held my knife in one hand, my headlamp in the other, and scanned the area. The beam of light swept across the trees, the creek, and the ground around my campsite. There was no one there, but the footsteps had been real. The touch on the tent had been real. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the cold fire pit, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hiked back to my car. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail was empty. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter or another camper who didn't realize I was there. But the way they moved, the way they circled my tent, it didn't feel random. I haven't been back to that spot since. I never thought a camping trip with my gym partner, Nick, would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was early September of 2018, the air still warm but starting to cool at night. Nick and I had been training together for about a year and had grown close. We shared the same goals, same routines, and the same love for the outdoors. When he suggested a weekend camping trip to unwind, I agreed without hesitation. We chose a remote spot in northern Colorado, a place Nick swore by. He claimed it was serene, untouched by the crowds that flocked to the more popular areas. He wasn't wrong. When we parked the truck at the trailhead and began the hike in, the sheer quietness of the forest struck me. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with bushes and weeds. The isolation was unnerving but also exciting. It felt like we were truly getting away from everything. After hiking for about 3 hours, we reached a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, flat ground for the tents, fresh water nearby, and surrounded by dense woods. We set up camp quickly. Nick had brought his large 2-person tent, so we decided to share it instead of setting up separate ones. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. We spent the first evening cooking over a small fire and talking about our workout routines and plans for the future. It was the kind of conversation we'd had dozens of times at the gym, but out here under the stars, it felt deeper somehow. The fire crackled, and the sounds of the forest surrounded us. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. By the time we crawled into the tent, the temperature had dropped significantly. I remember lying there, listening to the sounds outside, and feeling a strange sense of vulnerability. In the gym, Nick and I were the strong ones, the ones people asked for advice. Out here, we were just two guys in the middle of nowhere. The first night passed without incident, though I woke up several times, startled by noises outside the tent. Each time, Nick was fast asleep, his steady breathing reassuring me enough to drift back to sleep. The next day, we explored the area, venturing deeper into the woods. We found an abandoned cabin about a mile from our campsite. It was small and decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Nick thought it was cool and wanted to check it out, but something about it gave me a bad feeling. The air around the cabin felt heavy, like it didn't belong here. We didn't stay long. That evening, as we cooked dinner, I couldn't shake the unease from earlier. Nick, ever the optimist, brushed it off, saying we were just spooking ourselves because of how isolated we were. I wanted to believe him. The second night was when things started to go wrong. I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. It was subtle at first, just the crunch of leaves underfoot. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But as I lay there, holding my breath, the footsteps grew louder, closer. They were deliberate, too heavy to belong to any small animal. I nudged Nick awake, and we both lay there in silence, listening. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, pausing every few moments. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence was deafening. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I whispered to Nick that it was probably an animal and we should just stay quiet. He agreed, and we lay there, too scared to move. The next morning, there were no signs of anything unusual. No tracks, no disturbed earth, nothing. Nick joked about how paranoid we'd been, but I could tell he was shaken, too. We decided to stay another night, but promised to keep the fire going for as long as possible. That afternoon, we explored further downstream. The stream widened into a small, shallow pool, and we spent a while skipping rocks and talking. For a few hours, it felt like the tension from the night before was gone. But when we returned to camp, something was off. The first thing I noticed was that my backpack, which I'd left inside the tent, was sitting outside, unzipped. Its contents, food, clothes, a first aid kit, were strewn across the clearing. Nick's bag was untouched. At first, we thought it might have been an animal, but the way everything was spread out didn't make sense. It looked deliberate. Nick tried to laugh it off, but I could see the concern on his face. That night, we kept the fire roaring and stayed up as late as we could. The woods felt different, heavier, as if they were closing in on us. Around midnight, we finally retreated to the tent, though neither of us expected to sleep. I don't know how long I'd been lying there when the footsteps started again. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped directly in front of it. I could see the faint outline of a figure through the fabric. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. Neither of us moved. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity before walking away. We heard the footsteps fade into the distance, but we didn't dare leave the tent until the sun came up. The next morning, we packed up camp as quickly as we could. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just days before, now felt hostile. We didn't talk much as we hiked back to the truck, both of us on edge. When we reached the trailhead, we found something that stopped us in our tracks. Stuck to the windshield of the truck was a piece of paper. In messy handwriting, it read, "You're lucky you left." We didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. We jumped in the truck and drove away, the tension in the cab so thick it was suffocating. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us. I've thought about it countless times, trying to piece it together, Was it some backwoods hermit? A hunter who didn't want us there? Or someone with far darker intentions? I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, you realize how small and powerless you really are. The gym might make you strong, but strength means nothing when you're completely at someone else's mercy.